One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and I think this goes without saying, but 2022, hey, it's been a hell of a year.
Well, the Australian Institute has done a deep dive of every single appointment made to the tribunal.
According to a new study by the Australia Institute, research reveals the companies making super profits from the gas price.
To unpack the Treasurer's dilemma is Executive Director of the Australia Institute economist Dr. Richard Dennis.
RBA meeting today. I'm joined live by Senior Economist at the Australia Institute, Matt Grudnoff.
Jim Stanford is the director of the Centre for Future Work, which is an arm of the Australia Institute. He's just published an 11-page report.
Well, for a closer look at what's gone on at COP27, we're joined from Sharm el-Sheikh by Climate and Energy Program Director at the Australia Institute, Richie Merzian.
Margaret White is a former Queensland Supreme Court judge and with other retired judges sits on the Australia Institute's National Integrity Committee.
On this, we're joined in Canberra by Senior Researcher at the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program, Polly Hemming.
Let's bring in Alan Beam from the Australia Institute.
Joining us live now is report author Audrey Quick from the Australia Institute.
For a look at what's making news in print and online this morning, we're joined by Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, Ebony Bennett.
I'm not quite sure how the pandemic has affected you personally, but for me, one of the main things has been it's completely ruined my sense of time and when things happened. And it's a little bit difficult for me to remember everything that went on this year. So to refresh your memory and mine on today's Follow the Money, our final episode for this year, before our summer series begins after Christmas, we are going to take a look back at 2022. It's a year that has seen war in Europe, new waves of the global pandemic, and here in Australia, 2 federal budgets, 2 state elections, and of course, the federal election. Some of the big themes and issues have been climate change, integrity, and cost of living. And yeah, it's just been a big year, and we thought we'd cast our minds back. So let's get started. Cast your mind all the way back to January, when Novak Djokovic was being deported in the lead up to the Australian Open. It seems like years ago, but that was only in January. That was due to him being unvaccinated against COVID-19 while we were still in the grips of the pandemic. And obviously, to a certain extent, we still are. Champion tennis player and disability advocate Dylan Alcott was awarded Australian of the Year. And the previous Australian of the Year, child sexual abuse advocate Grace Tame, made headlines not for her fierce advocacy, but ridiculously for refusing to smile in a photo with the Prime Minister.
COVID hospitalisations in New South Wales have doubled in the week since Christmas.
That is our goal, to live with this virus, not to live in fear of it.
Paramedics warn the healthcare system can't handle the surging caseload of COVID-19.
The Australian Open is about to begin in Melbourne without its defending men's champion. Novak Djokovic has been deported.
Australia ultimately deporting him over fears he'd stoke anti-vax sentiment.
Australian of the Year Grace Tame has ended her tenure with a controversial appearance with the Prime Minister.
To make clear her criticism of the Prime Minister's handling of issues relating to women.
So if those of us with a voice don't use it to fight for what is right, to fight for those without a voice, then what hope is there?
In February, federal parliament was beset by the Convoy to Canberra, a protest movement mimicking similar convoys in Canada, made up of a combination of anti-vaxxers, sovereign citizens, and even some members of the Morrison government itself. February also signalled the start of this year's many so-called unprecedented or once-in-a-lifetime flood disasters. Frankly, those are happening so frequently, we can't really call them unprecedented or once in a lifetime anymore, can we? So they began in February, but also occurred again in July and October, and I know South Australia is experiencing some flooding at the moment. Over the course of this year, New South Wales, southeast Queensland and parts of Victoria and now South Australia, as I said, have been devastated by record-breaking floods and hitting a lot of communities across the country. On the 24th of February, Russia invaded Ukraine, launching attacks on the capital Kyiv, on the northeast city of Kharkiv and the southeast regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. This was the beginning of a terrible and ongoing humanitarian crisis, with millions of Ukrainian refugees fleeing the country, one of the largest refugee crises in Europe since World War II. Both Russia's war on Ukraine and the devastating floods in Australia have caused inflation to rise here in this country as well as globally, pushing up the price of food and causing the price of energy to skyrocket. Both inflation and skyrocketing energy prices are issues that we've touched on a few times this year on Follow the Money, especially in June when AEMO was forced to suspend the national electricity market.
We begin with wild scenes outside Parliament House, the building under siege today as tens of thousands of protesters rallied against COVID vaccine mandates.
I'm here as an Australian fighting for my rights, my freedom.
Well, for a start, we can just stop giving the states the vaccine.
Good afternoon. As we go to where northern New South Wales is bearing the brunt of a rain bomb causing major flooding. Here is what we know. Lismore is one of the area's hardest hit.
As this deadly rain bomb bears down on the southeast, there's been destruction on the Brisbane River.
The flood claimed a man's life in Indooroopilly overnight.
Everybody kept saying it's never going to happen again, 2011, but here we are.
We're now facing disasters of a scale that you just can't plan for.
Ukraine woke to explosions around the capital, Kyiv.
It was as sudden as it was brutal and relentless. Ukrainians woke up to find themselves plunged into the midst of war.
The full-scale invasion that intelligence officials had been warning about for weeks is now underway, and there are reports of explosions and attacks at several major Ukrainian cities.
Australia has lost one of its greatest cricketers of all time. Shane Warne dying from a suspected heart attack aged 52.
Tenacity, skill and suburban charm made him the best since Bradman.
South Australians are waking up with a new Premier this morning. Labor's Peter Malinauskas beating Liberals Stephen Marshall for the top job.
First-term Liberal government led by Stephen Marshall was trampled by Labor with a fresh-faced Peter Malinauskas.
Labor's Peter Malinauskas is now the new South Australian Premier. He's with me from Adelaide. Premier, congratulations on winning the election.
One of Australia's leading authorities is blowing the whistle on these schemes.
An environmental market without integrity is not an environmental market, it's a rort. And I feel that Australia's carbon market is just that. It's degenerated to become a rort.
But perhaps most egregiously, now we've got carbon neutral petrol and carbon neutral gas. If it sounds too good to be true, yeah, it probably is.
The South Australian election in March delivered a big win for the Labor Party under Peter Malinauskas, who promised to repeal the former Liberal government's tax on electric vehicles, something the Australia Institute has worked on a lot. Also in March, Professor Andrew McIntosh of the ANU came out with serious accusations of flaws in the Emissions Reduction Fund and the issuing of dodgy carbon credits, something the Australia Institute has also raised concerns about in its research. As the former chair of the Emission Reduction Fund's Integrity Commission, Professor McIntosh's claim cast significant doubt on the Australian government's strategy to reduce emissions. Also in March, we had the first of 2 federal budgets this year. That came on the 29th of March.
Mr. Speaker, a strong economy means a stronger budget, and this is what we deliver tonight.
The Treasurer opened his chequebook, spending billions, hoping to woo voters ahead of polling day.
There's also an election less than 2 months away.
Rather than addressing the issues of public health, stagnant wages growth and sustainability, the March budget seemed much more focused on just getting the government re-elected, prioritising one-time cash handouts to entice voters over any long-term or serious reforms. And not long after the budget, on the 10th of April, Scott Morrison announced the date for the federal election, which was held on May the 21st. So that officially kicked off the election campaign.
Scott Morrison flew to Canberra first thing this morning to visit the Governor-General.
Pulled the election trigger, sending millions of Australians to the polls for a May 21 ballot.
And those that have a go will get a go. Well, I've had a go, mate. I've worked all my life and paid my taxes.
What's the national unemployment rate?
National unemployment rate at the moment is, I think it's 5.4. Sorry. I'm not sure.
You said that the gender reassignment surgery for teenagers was mutilation. That was inappropriate?
Look, that is actually the correct medico-legal term.
News poll showing Labor's maintained its large lead over the coalition.
Voting is now closing on the East Coast.
The early results are coming in.
Anthony Albanese is Australia's new Prime Minister, and Labor are back in power after their first win in a decade.
We'll work every day to bring Australians together.
Teals and other independents have taken 10 seats across the country so far.
The mood for change this time saw millions of voters decisively abandon the major parties and, as a result, transform our politics.
And of course, the election resulted in Labor winning government and Anthony Albanese becoming the 31st Prime Minister of Australia with a majority in the House of Representatives. The Morrison government faced significant losses, with many of its blue ribbon seats going to independents and the Greens. The independents, the so-called teal independents, many of whom campaigned heavily on issues of integrity and climate change, saw huge success in seats right across the country. And here in Canberra, ex-Brumbies captain David Pocock won a seat as an independent in the ACT. That's the first time in Canberra that a senator has not been from the Labor or Liberal Party. Between Labor, the Greens and the Independents, this was a transformational election result, which resulted in, effectively, a climate supermajority in the Parliament, and setting the stage for a decisive shift in Australia's climate policy. The Prime Minister also promised in his speech on election night that he would hold a referendum for an Indigenous voice to Parliament to be enshrined in the Constitution.
And on behalf of the Australian Labor Party, I commit to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full.
We spoke with Pat Anderson and Professor Megan Davis, recipients of the Sydney Peace Prize for the Uluru Statement from the Heart, about the Uluru Statement and the voice to Parliament and what that would look like back in August.
This is part of nation building. It will change the narrative for the country, and hopefully it will change the way that you all relate to us, and we will have some power to make decisions about all the things that affect us and try to fix this torment of our powerlessness. That's where we're at now. It's the people of Australia who will decide, but I think this is the best chance we've had for decades.
The rest of May saw Anthony Albanese sworn in as Prime Minister, Peter Dutton elected as the new leader of the Liberals, and Anthony Albanese chose to move into the Lodge in Canberra, unlike many of his predecessors of recent years.
This morning, starting with that breaking news, Scott Morrison has just left Kirribilli House.
Certain now that Peter Dutton will take over leadership of the Liberals in opposition.
Mr. Speaker,
I'm just going to interrupt you. You continue to call me Mr. Speaker, and I've given it a long reign. You need to use my correct title, and when you're referring to other members.
That is a very valid point, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm sorry. But the fact is, Mr. Speaker, that there is a broader.
Terminally ill patients enduring unthinkable suffering will soon be able to choose when to end their pain, with an historic reform today passing New South Wales Parliament.
Hard fought and a long time coming.
This bill has passed both houses.
New South Wales is the last state to legalise voluntary assisted dying.
It also saw New South Wales pass the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act, putting the issue of territory rights and the rights of territories being unable to legislate for voluntary assisted dying back on the agenda for the federal parliament.
Well, the Australian Institute has done a deep dive of every single appointment made to the tribunal since 1996.
We're seeing a kind of a radical
reshaping of the AAT.
And will conduct a sweeping review of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal.
I'm going to be fully reviewing the operations of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal to make sure that it is fit for purpose.
Australia is facing its biggest energy crisis in 50 years.
Prices are high globally because European countries are looking for non-Russian sources of gas due to the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine.
Emergency talks of state and federal energy ministers. The group emerged from their 2-hour meeting yesterday.
The breaking news this afternoon is that the national energy market has been suspended. Talk about an energy crisis.
In June, Attorney General Mark Dreyfus committed to a review of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal following Australia Institute research that revealed that AAT political appointments were as high as 1 in 3 under the 2019 to 22 Morrison government, a rate of 40%. This again brought the issue of integrity in government right to the centre of Australian political debate.
But first, we want to get straight to that sad news breaking overnight. Award-winning Australian music titan Archie Roach has passed away at the age of 66.
His music told his story of survival.
New danger tonight is in the Hunter region, where evacuation orders and warnings have been issued as rivers rise. Daniel,
today floodwaters are still rising in some areas.
In breaking news this morning, Dame Olivia Newton-John has died at the age of 73.
The British-born Australian star had also become a campaigner for breast cancer awareness after her own diagnosis in the early 1990s.
For as well as being PM, Mr Morrison had himself secretly sworn in as Resources Minister, Finance Minister and Health Minister.
You're good at your job, you'll get a job, Mr Speaker.
Yes, that's right. The former PM came roaring back into the news with the revelation he had been appointed to a bunch of additional ministries by himself.
40 or 50 years watching politics, you think you've seen it all, and then something as weird and as wacky as this comes along.
A growing backlash to Scott Morrison's secret ministerial appointments this morning, with questions about whether he undermined Australia's constitution.
In August, integrity stayed firmly on the national agenda when the huge political scandal erupted when it was revealed that former Prime Minister Scott Morrison had secretly appointed himself to not 1, not 2, but 5 ministerial positions as Minister for the Departments of Health, Finance, Resources, Home Affairs and Treasury, completely without many of his colleagues' knowledge. This was an unprecedented and shocking revelation, which certainly contributed to undermining the already shaky trust Australians have in our government, and it made the calls for a National Anti-Corruption Commission even stronger.
People across the country have woken up to the news that Her Majesty has died.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Queen Elizabeth was the longest-serving monarch in British history.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family.
We've learnt this morning that Uncle Jack Charles has died from a stroke. In a statement put out by his publicist, they say that they're heartbroken.
He left a deep hole. He was a great man, great character, and I will forever remember his voice, and what a voice it was.
In some breaking news, the government's emissions reductions target of 43% is now enshrined in law.
Well, let's turn now to that remarkable moment in Parliament, long thought impossible. Australia enshrining its climate action goals into law.
Ayes 89, noes 55. The bills, as amended, have been agreed to.
Amendments were made to ensure more transparency and accountability around the reporting of climate targets. It's the first major step in climate action in more than a decade.
In the month between this bill passing the House of Representatives to this first day when it's now being debated in the Senate, The Minister for Resources, Madeleine King, has released 10 new oil and gas leases.
Optus revealed it was hit by one of the biggest cyber attacks in Australian history.
The Optus hacker has released the private data of up to 10,000 people.
Medicare details have now been added to the list of lost personal information.
Medibank has revealed that the cyber attack on its customers' data is much wider than originally thought.
Cyber attack against Woolworths has exposed the personal information of more than 2 million customers.
In September, we had yet another historical event with the death of Queen Elizabeth II on the 8th of September. She was succeeded by King Charles III, who was proclaimed King of Australia on the 11th by Governor-General Hurley.
Do now proclaim Prince Charles Philip Arthur George to be King Charles III, by grace of God, King of Australia and his realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth, and with hearty and humble affection, we promise him faith and obedience.
September also saw Australia's first climate change legislation in a decade, with Labor's climate bill passing the Parliament. Unfortunately, it didn't really go as far as it needs to. It includes targets of cutting emissions by at least 43% by 2030, a huge improvement on the previous target, as well as a target of reaching net zero emissions by 2030. But the bill itself didn't actually include any measures to reduce emissions in the private sector, something that's going to be taken up by the safeguards legislation that's set to be a huge issue for 2023. But nevertheless, it was a huge step forward for Australian climate policy.
October 2022, a weather event hits Tasmania. A huge rain band sweeps down over Australia's southeast.
Floodwaters on the Lachlan River today reached their peak in Forbes. Victoria's flood emergency is growing tonight, with towns and hundreds of properties under threat across the state. And Melbourne on alert for flash flooding.
Dozens of towns across New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia facing the threat of inundation as floods move downstream. The crisis expected to worsen over coming days.
Mitch, this is the biggest flooding threat that Seymour has experienced since the 1970s.
I present the Appropriation Bill Number 1, 2022-23, and the
government has just delivered its first federal budget, and it is all about cost of living.
Let's go straight to Budget 2022 because there is a lot to break down.
Grim outlook delivered in the first Albanese-Chalmers budget.
The budget impacts 26 million Australians differently, so understandably some are happy and others are disappointed.
We've got deficits, unfortunately, as far as the eye can see. That was the situation that we inherited. What this budget is all about is beginning to put the budget on a more sustainable footing, but there'll be more work to do.
In October, more heavy rainfall caused flooding in Victoria, Tasmania, New South Wales and South Australia, and we had the second federal budget for the year, handed down on the 25th. It was the debut budget for Treasurer Jim Chalmers, and while it delivered some welcome spending in areas like early education and childcare, aged care and paid parental leave, it certainly missed some great opportunities like scrapping the Stage 3 income tax cuts or improving resource taxes like the petroleum resource rent tax.
Federal government unveiled the details of its proposed...
The Albanese government finally delivered the detail of its model for a broad-based anti-corruption...
To establish a powerful, transparent and independent National Anti-Corruption Commission.
Today is an incredibly important day. All of these people standing behind me are here because they believe in a strong, robust Federal Integrity Commission, a watchdog with teeth.
Yes, well, at this stage, I think we can say that the Andrews government is set to be returned.
At this time, 9 News is willing to call this election for Daniel Andrews. He will win a third term as Premier of Victoria.
Daniel Andrews will become Victoria's longest-serving Labor Premier after a crushing election win that's reshaped the state's political landscape.
The annual UN Climate Summit, or COP27, a pivotal conference in Egypt to discuss climate change.
35,000 delegates are expected to attend COP27 this week, including 100 world leaders.
We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
Both Labor and Coalition who spruiked more coal and gas can't put the fire out while you're pouring petrol on it.
November was another huge month for Australian politics. the landmark National Anti-Corruption Commission Bill was welcomed as a huge step forward by the legal community and Australians at large. However, there remain concerns about the fact that public hearings by the Commission can only be held under exceptional circumstances, an extremely high bar and a concerning one that means this Commission will start out with a slight veil of secrecy over it. A federal anti-corruption commission is something the Australia Institute has been advocating for many years. And whatever its minor flaws, there is no doubt it will change the way Australian politics is conducted in Australia and its impact on our systems of governance and accountability and its ability to restore Australians' trust in government and politics cannot be overestimated. It's an idea whose time has come and it is long overdue. The United Nations Climate Summit COP27 was held in Sharm el-Sheikh in November as well. And while there were some huge wins, including an agreement for the establishment of a loss and damage fund, there was also the usual prevaricating around actual progress. And unfortunately, the final declaration included the promotion for, quote, low emission energy alongside renewables, which really weakened the previous agreement. The Victorian state election was also held in November, and while they were still counting into early December, it became clear very early on that the Labor Premier Daniel Andrews had won a second term. Despite some predicting that the lengthy Melbourne lockdowns due to the pandemic would sink the Andrews government, in the end, it was a decisive win for Labor.
The world is a very different place from when in 1997 this Parliament determined to take away the power to legislate over euthanasia from the ACT and the Northern Territory.
And so we really are seeing people in the Northern Territory and the ACT very much treated like second-class citizens.
For a quarter of a century, we've been barred from fully enjoying the same democratic rights as Australians living in the States. And it's ridiculous that we're still forced to explain why people living in the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory are worthy of having equal rights to other Australians, and yet here we are, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Sydney's most infamous climate protester has now been given bail after being locked up for bringing the Harbour Bridge to a standstill. It means she can spend Christmas at home, but she could be back behind bars by Easter.
Forced to return to Canberra for a pre-Christmas parliamentary flurry.
The quicker we do it, the reduce costs on households, the better.
Families are getting hurt now, so it's important we act now.
And the government's Energy Market Intervention Bill has passed through the lower house.
The federal government will be capping wholesale gas prices at $12 a gigajoule for the next 12 months.
Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures.
A big win for democracy came in early December as the Restoring Territory Rights Bill passed the federal parliament on the 1st of that month. After 25 years of being unable to decide for themselves, the ACT, Northern Territory and Norfolk Island will now be able to debate and pass voluntary assisted dying laws in their territories if they so choose. It was a huge win for democracy for Territorians. December also saw climate protester Deanna Violet Coco sentenced to 15 months in prison with a non-parole period of 8 months for stopping one lane of Sydney traffic for 28 minutes as part of a climate protest. After a year fraught with extreme weather and natural disasters made worse by climate change, it's an injustice that a climate change activist was given such a disproportionate sentence for a peaceful protest. And at the very least, it has brought attention to the raft of draconian anti-protester laws that have swept several states in recent months and years. So there we have it. That's certainly not everything that happened in 2022, but as I said, it has been an enormous year. And I want to thank you, our Follow the Money listeners across Australia and overseas. We so appreciate your support for this humble little podcast and for all your wonderful feedback and support. I also want to thank our producer Jennifer Macy, as well as Emily Perkins and my colleagues Hayden Starr and Eleanor Johnston-Leake for all their hard work on the podcast this year. Please stay tuned for our summer series, which will drop after Christmas, and we'll be bringing you some of our best conversations from our webinar series this year. And from everyone here at the Australia Institute, we hope you have a happy and peaceful summer and we'll see you next year. Thanks for listening.